Behavior in applied behavior analysis, a little closer look. Remember the three-term contingency, ABC, antecedent behavior consequence. Here we're going to talk about the B, the behavior. Behavior is dynamic. It changes over time. Behavior is also continuous. It requires continuous measurement over time. With an ABA, there's this idea of repeated measures. We're going to measure the behavior in the same way over time. This will allow us to compare. We can compare a person's behavior to itself over time. Or, if I want to say, like, hey, look, this person's attending behavior 5 years ago was much worse than it is now, we can do that as long as we're using the same types of measurements. Okay? But the point is that behavior is dynamic. It changes over time. You gain skills, and other skills get diminished simply because they're not reinforced. Doesn't mean the person loses the skill. I'm not trying to suggest that. I'm not trying to get all philosophical about that. What I'm saying, though, is if it's not reinforced, it probably will go away. But dynamic changes over time and is also continuous. It requires continuous measurement over time. The measurement systems that you're using, if you're going to compare, should be similar or identical. Would be the preferable way. Because you want to make sure that you're actually comparing apples to apples. If I do two types of measurement systems, it could be comparing apples to oranges. So again, I'll say it again, behavior is dynamic, it changes over time, and it's continuous. It requires continuous measurement over time. The idea of repeated measures is that we can measure behavior in the same way over time. This allows comparison. We can compare a person's behavior to itself over time. Here's a definition of behavior that I've always liked. Well, at least it makes me laugh. And you'll see why. It's very detailed. And while technically true, well, it is very true, it's a little dense. This definition comes from Johnston and Pennypacker from 1980 and revised in 1993. The behavior of an organism is that portion of an organism's interaction with the environment that is characterized by detectable displacement in space through time of some part of the organism, and that results in measurable change in at least one aspect of the environment. So blah blah blah. Basically what it means is that behavior is anything that an individual does that can be observed and measured and has some sort of impact on the environment. Again, I'm not trying to make fun of that definition, it's just because it is very true, it's just very dense. Another question I ask as a behavior analyst is, does it pass the dead man's test? Basically, if a dead man can do it, it's not behavior. In other words, we're going to refrain from describing behavior what the person didn't do, but rather what they did do. After all, if I say something like, the person didn't listen, well, a dead man doesn't listen. Okay, it wouldn't pass the dead man's test. So when I describe behaviors or write goals, it's always in that way, where I'm going to describe what they did do, or what I want them to do. Instead of saying, I don't want the person to get out of their seat, I'm going to say something like, I want the person to remain in their seat. I'm trying to frame it in the positive. Dead man's rule. For example, he didn't listen enough is not a good description of behavior. It doesn't pass the dead man's rule. A dead man could do that. A dead man doesn't listen enough. Rather, you could say, patient responds to my request 2 times out of 10. Again, this is just a good, and it's not scientific in any way, but it's just a good way real quickly to see, well, are you really describing behavior? Does it pass this idea of the dead man's rule? Basically, it's saying that behavior is what someone does, not what they don't do. As an RBT, I want you to understand that when describing behavior, describe what actually happens, not what didn't, or what the person couldn't do, or what you were feeling, or what they were thinking. Instead of saying he didn't do well on colors, you might say he completed 1 out of 5 tasks correctly. We want to frame it in the positive, what they did do, rather than what they did not do. So in general, in 2 broad ways that we'll describe behavior as a behavior analyst, I describe behavior in both its response topography and by its function. The response topography of a behavior is its form, what it looks like, what it smells like. what it feels like, its physical characteristics. The functional aspect of behavior is the effects of the behavior on the environment. For example, if I say "Run, it's Godzilla" while reading on a movie case, or if I was to say "Run, it's Godzilla" while being chased by a giant monster, both have the same topography. They look the same, right? They sound the same. "Run, it's Godzilla." But one is going to have a very different impact on the environment. As a behavior analyst, I'm typically more interested in how the behavior functions for that individual, rather than what it looks like. For example, if a child is yelling or screaming to get a cookie, the topography of yelling or screaming is not as important to me as what it actually gets the person. Because once I know what the function is, we can teach some sort of replacement behavior for the person to get that cookie. Likewise, there are things called a response class, the idea of a response class. This is a group of responses with the same function. Each response in that group of behaviors has the same effect on the environment. You ask a patient to name an animal, for instance, and the patient says cow. You reply with "great job." The patient could have said horse and got the same response, because horse and cow are in the same response class for that particular question. They are both animals. However, if you'd gotten a little more detailed and say name an animal that walks on two legs, neither horse nor cow would have listed a "great job," because that would not have belonged to the response class that went with that instruction. Something like kangaroo would belong there. So again, a response class is just a group of responses with the same function. Each response in the group of behaviors has the same effect on the environment. A repertoire, on the other hand, when I say a behavioral repertoire, it's all the behaviors a person can already do. What the person already knows how to do that's relevant to the task. As a behavior analyst, I typically find out what a person's current behavior repertoire is during an assessment period. I want to know what they can already do before we start targeting goals. The environment is a really important component of behavior, because all behavior occurs within an environment. Now, when I say environment, I'm not talking about environmentalism, global warming, all that kind of stuff. What I'm talking about is the immediate place where the behavior occurred. The environment is simply a description of where the person was. A 10 by 10 room with 3 chairs would be a description of an environment. Behavior cannot be emitted outside of an environmental situation. Behavior does not happen in a vacuum. There is always an environment. There is always a context to the behavior. Another important component when we're talking about behavior is the environment. Within our environment, there will always be stimuluses. A stimulus can basically be anything. A stimulus is basically anything a person can react to based on their senses: sight, smell, touch, hearing, feeling. Again, sight, smell, touch, hearing, feeling. A stimulus is anything that a person can react to based on these senses. For example, if I'm driving down the road and I see a pothole, that's a stimulus that I saw, and I'll swerve to avoid it. Likewise, if I walk into a room and I smell a nasty smell coming from the garbage can, my behavior will respond, and I'll try to get that garbage can out. I'll respond by engaging in that behavior to get the garbage can out. I reacted to a stimulus based on the smell. However, if I was to leave early one morning from my house and I took a different route, not knowing that maybe there was an accident or something on my normal route. I wouldn't say that the accident acted as a stimulus. Why? Because I didn't know about it. I couldn't see it, I couldn't smell it, or touch it, or hear it, or feel it. But if I had heard about it on the radio, and I changed my behavior based on that, it would have been a stimulus. So again, for it to be a stimulus, it needs to be something that the person reacts to based on their senses: sight, smell, touch, hearing, or feeling. We describe stimuluses formally by their physical features, size, color, etc. By their temporal relation to something, how close time-wise to the behavior of interest, or to the target behavior. How close was the stimulus to the behavior occurring? And we can also describe stimuluses by their functionality. What effect does it have on the behavior? For example, a nasty smelling garbage can prompts me to engage in behavior to get rid of that garbage can. Seeing a red light on a stoplight functionally causes me to hit my brakes. Seeing a cookie or a favorite dessert functionally prompts my son to ask if he can have it. Likewise, there is something known as a stimulus class. Any group of stimuli that share common elements in one or more of these following dimensions: the formal dimension of the stimuli, the temporal relation of stimuli, and the behavioral function of the stimulus change. For example, if I was describing a stimulus of stoplights, they all have a formal dimension of a green, yellow, and red light. They all should function the same. If the stimulus changes, the red light should mean stop, yellow light slow down, and green light go. Likewise, for the temporal relation of stimuli, a red light will always follow the yellow light in close proximity. I don't want you to get too hooked up or too focused on memorizing all of that, but just understand that any group of stimuli that share common elements is a stimulus class. Formal descriptions of stimuli, or formal dimensions of stimuli. We describe, we measure, and we can manipulate stimuli based on their size, color, intensity. Stimuli, or stimuluses, can be either social, such as attention, or non-social, such as tangible items. And again, that's not an exhaustive list. It's just a description of what stimuli can be. It will be broadly either social or non-social. The temporal locus of a stimuli. Behavior can be affected by a stimulus. These changes either occur prior to a behavior, which is known as the antecedent, remember, or immediately after the behavior, the consequence. When you see the word temporal, it's referring to time, some form of time, or when something happened. So, behavior can be affected by a stimulus. These changes occur either prior to behavior or after the behavior. The antecedent. Remember, antecedents are environmental condition or stimulus changes that occur prior to the behavior occurring. These are critical in learning and motivation. But the awareness of antecedents is not necessary for the learner's behavior. In other words, the person doesn't need to know why the condition or about the condition that led to their behavior for the behavior to occur. For example, occasionally I will go to homes and I'll start sneezing and coughing and wheezing. This is because I'm allergic to cats and they have a cat. But I will engage in those behaviors before I even know they have a cat. Or before I know they have a cat. So again, I don't need to know about the antecedent conditions for the behavior to actually occur. But as an RBT, you should be aware of antecedent conditions, because you can modify them to make behavior more or less likely. And we want the good behavior to be more likely, and the bad or undesired behavior to be less likely. The consequence, on the other hand, is stimulus change that follows a behavior, especially those that are immediate, and if the person is in a motivated state. This will influence the future likelihood of behavior. It will either increase or decrease it. If it increases it, it's said to be reinforcement. If it decreases it, it is said to have punished it. Again, the consequence is a stimulus change that follows a behavior. So the big picture here is that consequences combined with antecedent conditions and motivating situations are big in determining what is learned and maintained. And this is true of whether the individual is aware of it or even plans for it. It's all around us. People are learning skills, engaging in behaviors because of antecedent conditions and the consequences that behaviors have. You'll be using these terms and these skills when working with your patient. Being able to manipulate the antecedents to make behavior more likely or poor behavior less likely, and delivering reinforcement in the consequence realm, delivering stimuli after the behavior to increase its future likelihood. A little bit more detail about behavior. Behavior is either respondent or operant. Respondent behavior is brought out by a stimulus. That's the best way I could put it right now. Think of a reflex. You blow in an air into the eye, you blink. You do a loud noise, you cover your ears. It's kind of like a stimulus response. You smell favorite food, you drool. So think reflexes. Operant behavior, on the other hand, is any behavior whose frequency is determined by its history of consequence. As a behavior analyst, I'm more focused on operant behavior. Behavior whose future likelihood is determined by what it gets or doesn't get the individual. For example, when I press the power button on something, it turns on. That's operant behavior. The future frequency of me pressing the power button is that power button actually works. So if I had an item whose power button was malfunctioning or didn't work, I'd be less likely to press that power button on that particular object because of its history of consequences with me. If I press the power button and it doesn't work, that happens enough times, I'll start to press that power button less because of the history of consequences. I'm not reinforced by either the object turning on or turning off. Likewise, when I'm driving, I put my key in and turn it to start the engine. This is a behavior I've learned because of the consequence. I turn key, engine starts. Now I want to talk about the three-term contingency. Throughout this orientation and training, you've been learning about the ABCs, the antecedent, behavior, and consequence. This is known as the three-term contingency. It is the basic unit of analysis for looking at all operant behavior. All ABA procedures and techniques involve the manipulation of one or more components of the three-term contingency. This means that all interventions done as ABA principles, such as the one you will be doing as an RBT, is based off of this three-term contingency in some way. This is a very important thing to remember and realize, and to understand what antecedents, behaviors, and consequences are. Remember, antecedents are what is before the behavior, B is the behavior, and C are the consequences, what come after the behavior. And remember, I want to reiterate, the consequence is not a bad nor good thing. It is just what comes after the behavior. So what is a contingency then? A contingency is when the consequence is dependent on the occurrence of the behavior. Gaining a reinforcer when asked to name the animal is contingent on whether the person actually names the animal correctly within the parameters of the rules of what the teacher is asking. So if I say touch cow or what animal goes moo, and the person says cow, and I give them a reinforcement, that's a contingency. The reinforcement was dependent on whether the person answered correctly. So I want you to think of it like a contract. If you do this, then you will get this. Here's a couple popular contingencies within ABA. They're very similar. We have the first in contingency. First you clean your room, then you can play Minecraft. This is very similar to the Premack principle. In fact, they're about the same. In the Premack principle, also known as Grandma's rule, a preferred activity can reinforce a less frequently engaged in activity. Again, a preferred activity can reinforce a less frequently engaged in activity. It's known as Grandma's rule, where it's eat your veggies, then ice cream. So we're reinforcing the person eating their vegetables with ice cream. This is known as the Premack principle. So now that we're done talking about contingencies, let's talk about some examples of stimulus' different dimensions. Visual. The red light on or off on a power strip. When it's not lit, I turn it on. The consequence is now there's power. Again, that's the visual dimension of the stimulus. There's that little red light. If it's on, I will not engage in the behavior of flipping it off unless I want it to be turned off. Or if that light's not on and I want it to be on, I will engage in behavior that will turn it on, which is to flip the switch, or perhaps to plug the cord in. There's smell. If the trash can smells, I take the trash can out. Consequence, it removes the smell. There's feel or touch. I get in a car and it's very hot. I turn on the air conditioning. The consequence is it gets cooler. Sound. Walking, I hear a car horn. I stop walking. The consequences, I don't get hit or run over by the car. So those are examples of stimulus' different dimensions. So again, a stimulus can have several different dimensions that we can use in programming. A stimulus prompt makes a stimulus more noticeable. It reminds people what to do or how to do it. It can be used as an antecedent strategy within ABA. So as an RBT, you'll be using stimulus prompts, where you make the stimulus more noticeable, or you make the person more likely to be able to choose the correct stimulus. It is an antecedent strategy because it's occurring before the behavior. Broadly, there are two types of stimulus prompts: within stimulus prompts and extra stimulus prompts. Within stimulus prompts changes something about the stimulus itself. Make it brighter. Maybe change its color. The point is that you're changing something about the stimulus. Maybe move it closer to the individual. An extra stimulus prompt is something in addition to the stimulus. It's outside, it's extra. So circling something, or when you're working with your patient and you point to something in a gestural prompt, when you point to the item, that's an extra stimulus prompt. It's in addition to the stimulus. The point is, both stimulus prompts, we're talking about stimulus prompts, is it makes the stimulus more noticeable. Or it's telling us whether reinforcement is or is not available after it. Within stimulus prompts. Within stimulus prompts means that we're going to change something about the stimulus that indicates it is the correct item, or maybe perhaps that something's not available. If you're familiar with technology or how computers, web pages and stuff like that, if you see grayed out text, you will know that text, it probably means that clicking on that link or clicking on it is not available. It is a within stimulus prompt. They are changing something about the stimulus, the words. They're making the words less likely to be clicked due to the change in color. And that's only based on the history. Maybe perhaps if you think about the alternative. What if clicking on grayed out text did something really good? You'd be more likely to click on grayed out text. But because of the history of consequences, the learner's history with it, whereas clicking on grayed out text doesn't work, you are less likely to click on grayed out text. Again, the point I want to make though is that it's a within stimulus prompt. They're changing something about the stimulus. They're not adding anything extra. Now in the example right there in that picture, I actually have an extra stimulus prompt to illustrate the within stimulus prompt. That red circle, the red square, to show you would be an example of an extra stimulus prompt, right? I'm providing something extra so that you can see what I'm talking about. Here's another example of a within stimulus prompt. Let's say I'm working on letter identification and my target item is R in the QRP right there. By changing something about the stimulus, changing something about the R, making it blue, and if I have a history with that learner, that when the letter that I'm looking for, the target item is color, a different color, they're more likely to choose it. Again, I want to reiterate, there's no magic to it. There's no magic. Making the R blue doesn't really do anything. It's based on your history, your learning history, and how you reinforce that patient. If that patient gets used or gets reinforcement for touching the letters initially that are color, and you provide that consistently, they're going to learn that as a prompt. So there's no magic in the coloring the R blue. It just depends on your history of consequences with that learner. The point that I want to make though is that within stimulus prompt is that you're changing something about the stimulus itself. You contrast this with an extra stimulus prompt. This is something that's in addition to the stimulus. It's something extra that's added. Here's a couple of examples of extra stimulus prompts. So in that earlier example about the QRP, now I'm going to add an arrow. Instead of changing something about the stimulus, I'm just going to have something that's extra in addition to it. The arrow is an extra stimulus prompt. On the right side, you see a sign at a Little League baseball field telling parents or guardians some important information about acting responsibly. This is an extra stimulus prompt. The stimulus of being at a Little League baseball field and the additional stimuluses of seeing children play should be enough for people to act appropriately. However, if you've ever been to a Little League baseball game, if you've been enough times, you will notice that adults don't always act appropriately. Therefore, this league has established an extra stimulus prompt, a reminder for parents how to act. Or like here in California, when you're driving up past Valcaville, there's a stretch of road where it's really easy to go fast on. However, there's a lot of accidents there. So in addition to speed limit signs, you will see signs that say something to the effect of, "Is getting on time really worth your life?" These signs are extra stimulus prompts for the person to slow down. Stimulus fading. A stimulus, maybe a prompt, is gradually decreased until it is gone. How can we implement stimulus fading? Reduction in the physical qualities of the stimulus. Visibility, physical contact, volume, etc. Let's look how we would fade back that extra stimulus prompt I had, the one with the arrow. So this would be an example of prompt fading. We're going to fade this extra stimulus prompt out. So we start out with it being just like it was. But then we can change the dimensions of it. We can make it smaller and smaller until it's gone. That would be fading out the extra stimulus prompt. Now let's look at an example of stimulus fading. There's a really good example of stimulus fading. We're teaching this individual how to do 7 minus 2. If you notice, there are people in the picture. Those people are stimuluses to help the person to look at and count to get the correct answer. And if you notice throughout the page, the stimulus is fading. They're becoming less and less apparent. The stimuluses were there to help promote the person to count to complete the math problems. But remember, we want the person to be able to respond to just seeing 7 minus 2. So we have to fade out the extra help. And that's exactly what this picture is showing. That is an example of stimulus fading. We are making the stimulus less and less apparent until we can totally fade it out. Stimulus fading can be used to get rid of prompts entirely, or it can be used to transfer stimulus control from one stimulus to a more naturally occurring one. What does that mean? Stimulus control transfer. This is done to transfer behavioral control from stimulus prompts to naturally occurring stimuli, or the SD. You are transferring behavioral control from one antecedent to a more naturally occurring antecedent. In this case, an SD. An instruction. This minimizes errors, and it is something that you're doing throughout the session. This isn't something you just say, "Oh, I'm going to do this." It's something you're always doing when you're systematically fading back prompts. You do this when you are running discrete trials, incidental teaching, chaining, basically any program, by fading back those prompts. You are transferring the control of the prompt to the more naturally occurring antecedent, the instruction. So to illustrate this, let's go back to our elephant example. When I say touch elephant, and the person touches the elephant because of that arrow, they are really touching the elephant because of that prompt, right? I'm giving them that hint. But as I fade that prompt back, and I still use the same instruction, touch the elephant, while I'm fading that prompt back, what I'm doing is I'm transferring the control of that arrow, the stimulus control of them touching the elephant because of the arrow, to my more naturally occurring one, which is me saying touch the elephant. So as I fade that back, and then I can test it without the presence of a prompt. I can say touch the elephant, and if they are able to touch that elephant without the presence of that arrow, I can say that I've transferred the control of the stimulus, the arrow, to my more naturally occurring, me saying touch the elephant, the SD. I can say that a stimulus was transferred. Here's another example of stimulus control transfer. I see this used in classrooms a lot. Let's say we want a person to be able to recognize their name in written form. We would start by having their name and having an additional stimulus, a picture of themselves by their name. So once Simon here could identify his name with his picture, I would start to fade that picture out. So if you see in the top one, the picture is very clear, it's very bright. The second one, I'm starting to fade it out. I'm making it less and less bright until he could identify his name without the picture. I am transferring control of the additional stimulus, the picture, to the more naturally occurring stimulus, which is the name in written form. This is another example of stimulus control transfer, where we are taking a stimulus and transferring it the control of the behavior, here picking the name, to the more naturally occurring one, which is the name in written form. Notice how I faded it out over time. In applied behavior analysis, when we do things like fading or prompting, we do it systematically over time. We don't want to just take the picture away. So when I say we do something systematically, we do it in a stepwise procedure. We're doing it in consecutive steps. If we don't do things systematically, we might miss something, or the behavior may stop occurring because now suddenly there was help and now there's no help. So again, in applied behavior analysis as an RBT, I want you to get used to that idea that we do things in a systematic fashion. It usually involves several steps. And this is a really good example that illustrates this. Finally, the last thing I want to talk about in regards to behavior here is known as behavior momentum. Behavior momentum. In ABA speak, this is technically known as the high probability command sequence or high probability request sequence. Here we're going to deliver a series of high probability requests, something the person has a history of complying to or something they like to do. After they have complied, we're going to present a low probability or target request. This has been shown to decrease behaviors related to escape and creates engagement in the individual. Both goals that we have as an RBT, we don't want the person, the patient, to always be escaping or avoiding our request. We want them to engage with us. So this is one way we can promote that. So let's say the person enjoys physical actions but doesn't comply regularly with the request for their name. To do it, behavior momentum, I would say, clap your hands, touch your head, put your arms out, now what's your name? Instructions should be in the same sentence, and reinforcement for compliance should occur throughout. So realistically, it will sound like this. Clap your hands. Hey, awesome, clapping your hands. Touch your head. Oh, fantastic, that's awesome. Put your arms out. Oh man, I can't believe how awesome you are. Now what's your name? Hey, awesome, man, I can't believe you told me your name. That's so cool. Again, we want our instructions to be in the same tone. Behaviors in programming. These are some behaviors that you may see in programming as far as how they're labeled. Target or acquisition behavior. This is the behavior we are targeting to teach. The target behavior is to touch nose, for example. The BOI, or behavior of interest, this is typically the behavior or behaviors that have been targeted for reduction or, decreasing. His BOI is scratching his arm, so his behavior of interest is scratching his arm. Another phrase you may hear is terminal behavior. This is in shaping what the final form of the behavior looks like or sounds like. The terminal behavior is the verbalization water, for example. So those are just 3 examples of a way you may hear something phrased. You may hear the word target behavior or behavior of interest or terminal behavior. Okay. There's other types, but right now we'll just stick with these 3.